Tariffs or tax, they are not good for the United States. The idea that you can hide the price of just one good is a complete economic fallacy. Being a free trading nation, being more self-reliant, being willing to take risks and to trade with various countries and just building a stronger economy, not through government spending, but rather through unleashing the power of our private sector to build new projects and put people to work.
Concepts with Shawn.
Daniel Dufort is president of MEI. He has worked as a researcher, a political staffer, and as a public relations consultant. He's been published at all the major media outlets across Canada, and he's currently in Montreal. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Shawn. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So I wanted to immediately pick your brain on tariffs. Are tariffs a good idea or a bad idea? And our response to the Trump tariffs, has it been good or bad?
As a classical liberal, the answer is pretty easy for me. They are not a good idea. They are a terrible idea. Tariffs or tax, they are not good for the United States. I have a piece out this morning or yesterday in The Hill explaining the ripple effect that such tariffs will have. The idea that you can hide the price of just one good is a complete economic fallacy. There's also what you don't see, the way that Frédéric Bastiat would have said. So that when you decide to increase the price of aluminum, someday down the road, the cost of shipping will go up because a plane costs more or a truck costs more. So this will increase the cost of everything that people use. And while it may not drive up inflation, it will contribute to making life even less affordable than it is for middle-class Canadians and middle-class Americans. Now, whether a response to this has been good, I do not think that counter tariffs is the best way to go. That's just more taxes. And also, if you were to compare Canada and the US and add tariffs on everything, the sad reality, Shawn, is that we're going to run out of an economy much before they do, especially considering how reliant we are on exports to the US vis-a-vis how they are reliant on trade with us. It is not a very balanced relationship. I do not think we can win that. I am not a military expert or a general, but my instinct when someone is goading me into joining him on a field of battle, it's probably because that field is to his advantage and not to mine. So that's why I think we need to look elsewhere to find the right answers. And to me, those right answers would be to become the economic superpower that we can be with our natural resources. That is definitely a missed opportunity of the past decade that is now incumbent on us to seize. I would look to interprovincial trade. There are gains that we can make in that sense to grow our economy by trading more with one another. There's economic partnerships with other countries that can also be strengthened, even though this is no silver bullet. And also, I think we need to look at lowering taxes and regulations to unleash the potential of our private sector.
Brilliant. So you're the only person that I've heard recently properly pronounce Bastiat's name.
Frédéric Bastiat, and maybe that's because I'm one of the few francophones that you didn't speak to.
That's right. I know that I'm embarrassed to say. So, and his most famous book was Something in the State, or where should people start reading him? I can't remember the title of his most famous book.
Well, MEI, we actually have a little booklet with some of his most famous writings. One of the most famous one would be about the candle makers, which is this little, not fable, but little story about how candle makers and others would sign a petition complaining about windows and the sun and the adverse impact it is having on their business, that this is unfair, which is not entirely unlike the debate we are seeing right now on trade and a host of other issues. Like you could talk about AI and automation and all of these things, all of the situations when you see these groups trying to obtain a gain at the expense of everyone else. This is when Bastia is still highly relevant today.
Brilliant. And so your copy of Bastia is available on your website, or how do people get?
I believe that it is. This is from a long time ago. I will look it up and I will send it to you.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, no, because and we're going to circle back to this probably at the end of our talk about the other educational opportunities that you're leading at MEI, but good answer on tariffs. Now, the problem is, Daniel, you and I agree on way too much, so I have to pretend like I have to think of a way to push back a little bit. And so you mentioned interprovincial trade. Don't we essentially have protectionism and tariffs currently within Canada? How can we criticize Trump for protecting his country when each of our provinces are already protecting each other and not letting adjacent provinces trade with them?
Sadly for you, I actually still agree with you here. And at MEI, we've been writing on this topic for well over a decade about the importance of having interprovincial free trade. You may remember that there was a Supreme Court case on this topic, the Como case, and MEI, along with the Canadian Constitution Foundation and AIMS, which is now part of the Fraser Institute, we had launched an initiative called One Country, One Market to promote interprovincial free trade. And it gets a lot of support notionally, but it's when you try to actually do it, when you get into the nitty gritty, this is where you run into all of those entrenched interests that will advocate for maintaining the small advantages that they've been able to extirpate at the expenses of everyone else, and everyone else being consumers. And they add up in a big way. They add up to billions of dollars every year, and they are a drain on Canadian standard of living. And that's why we need to fight back against all of those trade barriers, but they can be tough to pin down. It is really myriad of small measures that you would look at and say, it's not that bad, but not that bad multiplied thousands of times, it adds up to pretty bad. And now we have this patchwork of regulations applying across the country that makes it much tougher to ship goods across the country because trucking regulations will not be the same. Maybe you have to switch tires. Maybe you cannot work the same hours in one province next to the other. Maybe you'll need different certifications for your trade in Gatineau than you would in Ottawa, just across the river. So all of this adds up. It is a massive drain on our economy, and it is about time that we face it.
So would you say you are an economic nationalist?
No, I don't know if that's the right word, especially sitting where I do in Quebec. I don't think that people would necessarily have the same definition of what being an economic nationalist is. But I do think that we need to harmonize the regulations that we have. And of course, that ends up having an impact on provincial sovereignty, if you would. But in this case, I do believe that it is for the greater good.
Yeah, good, great answer. And I apologize for springing that on you. I didn't warn you about that. It's just I've been thinking about Diefenbaker the last couple of days. I was talking with Bob Plamondon yesterday, and Diefenbaker was a big nationalist, and to a fault, right? He just did not understand Quebec at all, but
it was supported, I believe, by Maurice Duplessis for some time.
Yes, yeah, you're right. Yeah, so. Anyways, I often detect some hypocrisy in the people that speak very loud against Trump's tariffs, but really go pretty quiet when it's an issue of interprovincial trade.
Well, the pearl clutching has been funny from where I stand, not because I support Trump's tariffs, but to the contrary. And on the record, extensively, very much against that. But the idea that we can't do better ourselves is quite frankly laughable.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned a few times about benefits that accrue to the people who maintain these trade barriers and regulations. And I couldn't help thinking, I'm scribbling notes, rent seeking, question externalities or externalizing costs. And I'm wondering, do you like public choice theory? And if so, do you want to talk about it a bit?
Public choice theory is definitely very important when it comes to try and understand the things that around you and how they work. If we were to really simplify it, it's just about the minority of people who have a deeply vested interest in something either happening or not happening. They'll form coalitions and they will make a lot of noise about it, and they will end up overtaking the silent majority of people. You see this in so many instances that it is quite frankly a little depressing. Supply management, which is a completely regressive measure that hurts low-income families in this country that needs eggs, milk, and chicken. It is very costly to them, but very useful to the small number of farmers who benefit from it. So that is perhaps the poster boy for these interests in the country. But if we were to switch the topic to energy, you would see the same dynamic, because Quebec also has this situation around pipelines. We have, I don't know, maybe 50 different individuals in Quebec or 200 different associations that are against pipelines, but there are a small minority of people who are extremely vocal. The latest polls that I was seeing, you had 76% of Quebecers in favor of an east-west, west-east pipeline, east-west, no matter how you want to put it. 76 sounds a bit high to me. Maybe mid-60s is more of the accurate number, I would think. But, it's more between mid-60s and mid-70s. So a clear majority of Quebecers. And the premier of Quebec is now saying, maybe the situation has evolved. If you were to look at the polls, it has clearly evolved, but they're still afraid of that minority, that very vocal minority. That is another example of the same phenomenon that is behind public choice theory. This is when minorities manage to overtake the policy decision process by being so vocal and coalescing around one issue.
Yeah. So again, I have to pretend like I'm disagreeing with you here. So I'm trying to think, if we abolish all interprovincial trade barriers and regulations are uniform from coast to coast, won't that destroy the unique differences that we love in the different regions in our country? And specifically now we're talking about Quebec and pipelines. I actually have some sympathy to that argument. Full confession, I grew up in Thunder Bay, and I thought everything bad about Canada was because of Toronto and Quebec. And now I live just near Toronto, and I've actually come to appreciate it. And now I've come to love Quebec too. Quebec fights for itself. I think it's fantastic. I don't agree with everything they fight for, but I totally understand that, we're trying to maintain a way of living and a regional diversity that would simply not exist if we demanded uniformity from coast to coast. So how do you respond to my newfound love of Quebec and my worry that it will be homogenized if we get rid of all these interprovincial trade barriers?
I don't think these barriers actually caught at culture, unless you were going to convince me that some of these exemptions are truly culture focused. But so two things. One, right now the Quebec government is trying to say that a lot of the remaining exemptions are just to protect the French language. And it's false. That is not true. It is a cop-out. Now, in terms of culture, if you were to look at the exemptions that do exist, for Ontario in particular, and I'm not an expert on Ontario, despite living there for a few years in the past. I lived in Ottawa, forgive me. But one of the exemptions for Ontario is about wild rice and who can harvest wild rice. Like, it is possible that there's something very particular about Ontarian culture and a wild rice, but I don't think that they are related. I would think that this is designed to protect the small interest, the vested interest of a small number of farmers. It's not because Ontario as a whole has this cultural interest in a wild rice.
Yeah, great answer. In fact, I was just researching recently. My kids are into gardening, and they have heritage chickens and all these brightly colored eggs. And so I was researching ginseng, and apparently it grows very well in our forests, but you need a license to grow it, and you're not allowed to grow it. It's very difficult to actually get any kind of harvest out of it. But again, to your point, the argument raised is to protect, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly what they're protecting, but it certainly protects the people who have a license to produce it. And it's frustrating. I don't agree with it, but okay, interprovincial trade, tariffs, and I wanted to get your thoughts on housing because I know MEI has done some recent work on housing. Is housing something that the government can really fix for us? Isn't that more up to individuals?
I think the government needs to get out of the way on housing. We have such an abundant supply of land that truly we should be able to build on it. But what we've been seeing, I was just looking at recent numbers in Quebec, and you could see on the island of Montreal, new builds are really slow to start. We're just not building. We're just not. And the population keeps growing at a pace far outstripping the pace at which we're building. And that is just a fundamental issue if you want to maintain some level of affordability. We've been really looking at it just in blunt terms of supply and demand and how the effect of increased supply will have a cascading effect of lowering prices all across the housing spectrum. That is to say that even if you were to build only new penthouses in the city of Toronto. Now, I don't know how a building could be only penthouses. It's a little antithetical, but let's still take this absurd example that the left would enjoy. So we're building only penthouses. What you would see, and there's research from Yvonne Mast at the University of Notre Dame about the fact that these penthouses, because of the people moving into them, presumably living somewhere else before and moving out of there, you will have this cascading effect. And in the end, even you will make housing more affordable, even for the fifth quintile of the equation, for the very cheapest accommodation. So this is the impetus to build more in order for things to be more affordable. One of the reasons we have seized on that issue, quite frankly, Shawn, at MEI, our mission is to do economic education. And that seemed to us like a great opportunity to explain key concepts to younger Canadians, these key concepts being supply and demand, the trickle-down effect, if you will, this chain displacement effect, the cascading effects, all of these things. And honestly, there was a lot of media interest in it before everything became about tariffs, but it has really been interesting for us to take a deep dive in this and discuss it a little bit more from that perspective of, we actually just need more supply here, and that can actually provide a long-term answer to the problem.
Yeah. Good answer. I like everything you've said, and I think there is an opportunity for leadership at making the approvals process easier, zoning change, and all that's involved there. However, I listened to the politicians saying, we're going to have all these houses built, and I think you really haven't said anything about the housing industry. You haven't said anything about the trades. You haven't said anything about the massive barriers to just a regular person building a garage in their property or developing a small piece of property, putting up a cottage. So in Ontario, they just changed the regulations on the size of structure that you could build. It used to be only a 10 by 10 structure that you could build yourself without a permit. Now it's 10 by 16. I believe that's the case. And you can put that up without a permit. Now, it can't have a foundation, it can't have wiring or plumbing or anything, but you get a rudimentary structure as a bunky cottage at the lake if you're lucky enough to find property that you can afford. It was only 30, maybe 40 years ago when it was not that uncommon, especially when you get outside of cities, for people to be able to put up their own houses or to put up a house with their neighborhood. If you go back to the 1950s, you could order a whole house kit from Sears and they would deliver it and you put it together. So somehow we've become a lot stupider in the last 60 or 70 years, or people are now burdened with so many regulations about the exact thickness of the vapor barrier and the exact bit of plastic that needs to go over the top sill plate between the rafters and the exact hurricane ties, and the number of regulations that the average person would have to be able to tick box off just to be able to put up a very simple A-frame bungalow makes it insurmountable unless you're a graduate student in the building trades if you were going to go build something yourself. So
I could not agree with you more, Shawn. And if you look also at the occupational licensing requirements, so in the province of Quebec, and now I know they've made changes to this last year, so I'm going to be off on my number. Okay, I'll just warn you. But it used to be that you had just in the trades, the building trades, 25 different professions. And if you were to install a new door and paint it, that would require the skills from 10 of these different professions. So 10 different individuals with different credentials to install a door and paint it. Obviously, the construction sector has been impervious to productivity gains for the past 30, 40, or perhaps even 50 years. There was a working paper on this circulating last year that was quite interesting. So there was absolutely no productivity gains because you're inheriting a system that was put in place for a vastly different era. This is what they were doing. We had the baby boomers coming up and we needed jobs for as many people as possible. So coming up with all of those schemes to ensure that everyone had a job was at premium. But now we have massive skills shortages and we just don't have enough workers. And we're stuck with these regulations made for a completely different era. And it is definitely contributing to the crisis that we're seeing.
Yeah. So is this something MEI is going to take up? It's a huge rat's nest to try to tackle, but
we've been writing about occupational licensing and construction for some time, and looking at Quebec specifically because it is the worst province of them all, as far as I know. We have been seeing moderate movement on that file. I believe that it will become absolutely inevitable. We just do not have enough people to build all of the things that we need. Just to give you one example. So Hydro-Quebec, so the big electricity utility, recently realized that they had badly messed up their forecasting for future electricity demand. So they need to increase their supply by roughly 50%. You need to massively expand what they're doing. So that means new dams, new projects, et cetera, et cetera. So what they're saying is that you will need to employ the equivalent of fully 1/3 of all construction workers in the province of Quebec for well over a decade. So how do you build new houses when 1/3 of the workers are just building dams?
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, no, it's unreal. And it makes sense why the small house movement is going so strong, and some of these container homes, and people are, I don't know that they would be pursuing those options if it wasn't a little easier for them to buy a house in a box and put it up. I would think that approach would be even easier now in our era of transport. And
I welcome the prospect of a 3D printed house, but
yeah,
I don't think that this is something we are going to see in the
no,
next few years. And I say that in jest, but it does seem to me that we are quite frankly living in the past
totally.
on these matters, and that we are struggling to put our best foot forward. I just look at the greater region of Montreal where I'm talking you from today, and just south of the river. So on the other side of the St. Lawrence, there's a lot of land that you could build on if the federal government and Stephen Guilbeault had not decided that this specific type of frog needed to be preserved.
Yeah.
So we have land that we cannot build on.
Yeah, no, on the 3D printed house thing, there is actually a concrete 3D printed house. I'll send you a link for it where, yeah, there's this great big, it looks like a gigantic CNC machine arm that puts out little strips of concrete icing on a cake and slowly builds it up. And now there's a lot of other work that has to go into it, but at least someone's thinking about it. Now, I'm trying to think of ways to push back. I like Roger Scruton, and he's written about aesthetics and architecture and maintaining the feeling or a unique nature of a community, making them beautiful. And he writes fairly eloquently about, I think it was he who wrote about someone from California, I think, who put a gigantic dolphin or shark on the roof of their house in a beautiful downtown village or hamlet in Britain. And someone bought the house and removed it. But what are your thoughts on that now if we're thinking about improving housing opportunities within communities that are beautiful or downtown environments? Has MEI turned its mind to that issue?
Yeah, I cannot say that I have, or that we have as an organization, but I would say a couple of things. One of them is Tokyo has famously clamped down on all of these regulations in the early 2000s. And while some of the individual buildings may look a little out of place, I don't think that Tokyo is now an international scourge. To the contrary, people still love going to Tokyo and really are impressed with its dynamism. On the other end, I would say that when I look at a lot of the things that we consider the ugliest in our cities, they are often the fruit of central planning.
Yeah, no, very good answer. So how can we get people to be smarter and not to run afoul of public choice ideas? These aren't new ideas. And so I guess I'm trying to lead you into your work that you're doing on liberty leadership. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, I do think that we need to rediscover a lot of what has made us great. And that would include what I like to refer to as classical liberal values, by which I mean the traits that will make you successful in the marketplace: being hardworking, being trustworthy, being willing to collaborate with others. All of these traits that will make you successful, these traits that you will either inherit or that you will grow to have. So I think that those are fundamental in terms of addressing the issues of today and chartering a better path for our country, especially as we are facing extremely important issues today. And I know I'm going on a bit of tangent here, but you're sensing that there is a kind of a fork in the road where some people are nostalgic about a past that, quite frankly, I have not known as being younger, or maybe just as a French Canadian, I cannot relate to some of the examples being bandied around in various advertisements. And there's the forward-looking path, which oddly enough borrows a lot from old ideas, classical liberal ideas about being a free trading nation, being more self-reliant, being willing to take risks and to trade with various countries and just building a stronger economy, not through government spending, but rather through unleashing the power of our private sector to build new projects and put people to work. That does not speak to liberty and leadership, but it does talk to something else that I believe is crucial today, right now, and in the weeks and months to come.
Yeah. So I love what you're saying. Hard work, learning how to collaborate, being trustworthy, self-reliant, taking measured risks. That group of ideas sounds like your opinion about what works. And now, how do you get away from the accusation that you're just pushing what you think is good and good for society on me? Isn't that an illiberal thing of you to do?
I'm certainly not going to coerce you into doing those things. Only the government would take such liberties or illiberties with you. So quite frankly, this is not what we're getting at. But when you read about how young people view the world, and I guess it will depend on which poll you're looking at and so on and so forth. But recently I was reading a book called L'Art de la Flemme, because it's a French book by Olivier Babot, but I would translate that as The Age of Sloth. And it's just talking about how people in France are no longer as hard working as they used to be, which perhaps will come as no surprises to a lot of people. But in this book, there is one statistic about young Canadians, and it says that they are likelier to believe that success hinges primarily on luck than on hard work. And it used to be the polar opposite. I do think that these types of beliefs are harmful to our society and that it must be addressed and fought back against if we are going to continue to build a more prosperous and open society.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I was getting a little stressed for you there for a second, but you just came out and said, well, we're not coercing anyone. So that was brilliant.
Really, only big government believers would do that. Now, so we are doing what we can to promote these values in economic education, which is why we've put together a completely voluntary program called Liberty and Leadership, where we welcome 50 students every year to Montreal for a seminar to talk about economic education, classical liberal philosophy. And we target mostly people who are interested in one day working in politics. And we also find them mentors and internship opportunities and create a bit of a sense of community for these people to come together and network. And it is going to be the second edition in a couple of months now. And we always have some great speakers who come. I know you had Shawn on your podcast. Shawn was with us last year. It will be with us this year again. Bruce Hardy will be joining as well. So we have put together a truly great program that I think can be very impactful if a few of those people one day become politicians and keep in mind the principles that they will have learned about. That will be a tremendous success.
Oh, absolutely. And I have no doubt that your Liberty and Leadership program will do well. And we have to start at that level. It's like the Runnymede Society in the legal world. The other thing I was going to ask, and I ask everybody this, what have I not asked you that I should be asking you? So you're spending your life in this space, and what have I completely overlooked, or what do you wish people were asking more about?
It's funny that we have not talked about this because I know you are so passionate about these issues. And it may not be the most topical right now, but the state of our healthcare system, quite frankly, I think Canadians ought to be a little more indignant about. I think we've been tolerating a state of affairs that is quite frankly intolerable. In no other countries in the world would you see people going about enacting as though everything was fine. So at MEI, healthcare reform has been one of our most important topics from our very inception more than 25 years ago. And we go and we look at healthcare systems around the world to compare and learn more about what they do. And recently, I was in France because we were shooting a small documentary with our friends at secondsuite.org. And you could see people being completely appalled by the state of ERs in France because sometimes they have to wait up to 3 hours over there. And they think that this is appalling. And you come back to Canada and 3 hours is nothing. You're extremely lucky if it's 3 hours. And when they learn about what we're putting up with, they just cannot believe it.
Yeah.
I think that healthcare is going to be a major issue going forward with an aging population. As we do have, things are only going to get worse. We do need to look at solutions that Canadian decision makers are not quite willing to look at on the best of days. But this is just around the corner. And if we don't act, who knows when the system is going to completely collapse.
Yeah, and a huge shout out to MEI and the work you've done on
And you've been doing great work on this topic, Shawn.
Thank you. I try not to bring healthcare onto this really at all, but as an opportunity to highlight the work you've done, certainly people need to look at your left without being seen work, your emergency department flow work, hospital efficiency, comparing under different management styles, how one hospital will just function better because they're not having the same how do we please the Minister of Health approach as opposed to how can we please the patient and actually do what's good for them. So yeah, huge shout out to you guys there as well. I'll put links in the show notes to MEI and the work that you've done there. If there is a way for people to support the work that you're doing, can they become partners with MEI or you're a charitable organization? How does that work?
Yes, MEI is a charity, so obviously we're always looking for new donors, but also for you collaborators who are always publishing new up-and-coming authors, economists, researchers. So definitely open to partnerships. And I would encourage people to read about what we're doing and spread the good word.
Yeah, brilliant. And I guess as you were talking there, it reminded me of something I've been harping on recently, that for a democracy to work, insofar as it ever will work, but for a democracy to work, it needs to be a participatory democracy. And participation doesn't mean going out to vote. We're in the middle of an election cycle right now towards the federal election, towards the end of the month. Simply going to vote is not participation. Yes, of course you need to vote, but you also need to be paying attention to institutions like MEI. You need to be reading the material, talking about it with your friends and neighbors, donating if you have the means to do, or offering opinions if you have the means to do. But that's what participation means. And I think that's, at least to my mind, that's the only way we're going to be able to get out of this social malaise that we've been in for the last 5 to 10 years, perhaps longer, but especially for the last 5 to 10 years. Daniel, it's been fantastic having you here. Thank you for taking the time to be with me, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Thank you very much, Shawn, and looking forward to seeing you soon.
Great.